Hello, and welcome to the premiere episode of the Intelligent Minds podcast with me, your host, Aimee and Niyama. Today's topic is navigating adult relationships, featuring our guest speaker, Niyama Fulkroad. Niyama Fulkroad holds an MA in school counseling and a BA in English, and currently serves as a school counselor at a private school north of Tampa. I've invited her to speak today about cultivating healthy adult relationships and pruning, or at least surviving, toxic ones by identifying the types of conversation that the relationship favors and applying certain strategies. Niyama, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic.
Thank you for coming. As we all begin to communicate using more and more digital methods during this social distancing COVID-19 global pandemic season of our lives, I wanted to ask you to share some insight and tips into developing healthy conversations and relationships. Okay, so straight off the bat, what kinds of resources are available to adults or kids that are suffering in an abusive relationship right now and need urgent help? I'm thinking about like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, psychological abuse, even financial or material exploitation, even neglect, abandonment, self-neglect. What kinds of resources are available to people?
Well, there's a hotline that's 211 that is available across the United States, and it will tap into different local agencies that are available to help. So a person could call that hotline 24 hours a day and let them know what their particular circumstance is, and then they'll be routed to local agencies that can help them. There's also the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That's 1-800-273-TALK, TALK, and that is also available 24 hours a day. And then there's also a crisis text line. If it's not safe to actually have a conversation, then the person can text 741-741, and they can receive some support, again, 24 hours a day.
Thank you for sharing those resources with our listeners. So the idea for this episode grew from a recent experience of mine where a friend, an adult peer, interacted with me in a way that I could only really describe as adolescent. She chose to talk to me through text messaging, which, as we all know, has limits for communication because it doesn't include nonverbal communication, tone, body language. But from her messages, I could tell that she was really trying to get some kind of reaction out of me. So my question for you is, why would an adult use such primitive means of inciting a reaction? Because clearly this level of communication isn't healthy. And if we know as adults that threats and insults don't work, why would another adult weaponize comments to someone?
That's a power play. It's about getting the upper hand in a situation and instant gratification. Threats and insults hurt the person who they're being targeted at and take us off guard. You also don't have the ability to fully respond via text message. The person initiating gets to share their feelings right away, while you don't. You're stuck reading it and fuming about it and marinating in it, and the other person has gotten whatever they wanted to get off their chest out.
So how do we confront unhealthy messages?
The best way to do that is quickly, in an open and honest way. When we wait, we let it fester. That's not to say that we shouldn't take a moment to gather our thoughts and put together a well thought out statement. And honestly, sharing your feelings with the person who's sending out these messages will enlighten them to where you're coming from. So many times we get caught up in our own stuff that we forget how our words and messages land with others.
So true. Okay, I'm thinking about, how do we confront a colleague in the workplace now who consistently partakes in an unhealthy type of conversation? So I'm thinking about gossiping, lecturing in a condescending way, insults, or even arguing.
That's a tough one because we need to preserve the relationships that we have with coworkers. If for no other reason than to make sure we have an amicable environment at work. In this situation, the first step is to avoid those types of conversations. When the topic turns to gossip, insults, arguments, and other negative topics, we can excuse ourselves and hope those engaging will get the message. Beyond that, it's best to have a one-on-one with the person or persons who are partaking in these types of conversations. I find it best to say something like, when the conversation turns to X, Y, and Z, it makes me uncomfortable because I would really rather focus on work at work. And then hopefully they'll get the message from there.
When would it be appropriate, or is it ever appropriate, to ghost someone or to cease communication or a relationship with someone?
When someone is taking a toll on your mental and emotional health, it's absolutely all right to cut them loose. If you've tried to mend the relationship and the person still isn't respecting your boundaries, move on. I think it's absolutely appropriate at that point to go ahead and ghost them.
Another way adults interact with each other negatively is by verbally judging each other's choices, whether it's about a new relationship, a financial purchase, a parenting choice, or COVID-19 social distancing. How does a person deal with unsolicited advice or condescending judgment from a peer or maybe even their own parent?
The first thing to take stock of in this scenario is the value of the relationship. Some relationships are more expendable than others. Additionally, some relationships need to be preserved, like those with parents. So we have to take that into consideration when we respond.
Okay, I'll give the parents some airtime. How should parents communicate with their adult children about sensitive topics where there is disagreement?
So parents should remember that their children are adults with valuable experience and that they should listen and converse with them as they would other respected adults. While adult children will always be their parents' children, when parents can appreciate the knowledge that their grown-up children have, it opens doors to a richer, deeper relationship.
True, so true. Okay, so earlier we were talking about texting. I want to come back to these forms of communication that have limited depth of clarification. I tend to call them two-dimensional forms, such as the typed correspondence, such as email, Facebook posts, comments, or articles. What strategies can you share about communicating using written or typed words?
Well, we have to be extra sensitive about how we come across in typed and written communications. The recipient doesn't get the additional context clues of facial expressions and tone to decipher what's really meant. I think we've all been the receiver or sender of misunderstood messages, and it is no fun to have to backtrack and clear things up. Clear, concise language is always best in written formats. Additionally, when the sender is feeling emotional, they should write everything they want to say, but wait until they've had a chance to calm down, reread it, and then send it if it still feels appropriate.
I've done that many times myself. The question everyone has been waiting for: how do we talk about controversial topics and politics with other adults in any forum in a healthy way without being divisive? Do we just ignore a particular topic in public?
Well, this may sound like a coward's answer, but I say avoid these topics when you know that they're no longer just topics. By that, I mean that others have attached value and emotion to the subject, and it's evident that feelings will be hurt if the conversation continues. It goes back to what I mentioned earlier about the value that we place on the relationship. Do we want to risk permanently damaging a relationship over a discussion where we were never going to make any headway? But on the flip side, if we know going into it that the other people know how to discuss topics without attaching emotion and value, then hey, have at it and enjoy a civilized discourse with some other civilized humans.
Okay, so you and I have both spent over a decade in a school setting interacting with students from both middle school and high school. So we are heedfully familiar with the hallmarks of communications for teens: ultimatums, threats, insults, gossiping, arguing. This year in the classroom, I wanted to create a chart for students where they could see, on a scale of unhealthy to healthy, all of the different types of conversations that people can have. So we created this chart together as we looked at different characters from the books we were reading, and I want to share them with our listeners so that they too can think about how growth and awareness happen when you reach for those healthy types of conversation instead of falling back on the easier, more abrasive, more abusive, or unhealthy types. So we started with the red category. This category included manipulation, ultimatums, threats, verbal abuse, and insults. One of my students shared how this level is commonly utilized by toddlers, right? Because they haven't learned the skills of the higher categories and they have immediate needs, so they use what they know. How do adults cope with someone, a toddler or maybe another adult even, that utilizes these specific toxic methods?
For adults, I say call them on it. If there are adults who behave in this manner, that means they've been doing it for a long time and it's been working. If confronting them about their tactics doesn't work, remove yourself from that situation or relationship. The unhealthy types of communication that fall into the red category amount to abuse. And if the person won't change, then it's important to take care of yourself and leave that situation.
Okay, so I'm a young teacher. I started teaching in the classroom 13 years ago, fresh out of college at the age of 22, and no one let me forget it for at least 10 years. I was the youngest, and everyone felt like they had something to offer me. And while I received mostly positive feedback, how do we interact with a colleague who condescends to us based on our age or gender, our religion, or our ethnicity?
The answer to that question doesn't fall solely on the individuals at play. Businesses play a role in addressing and thwarting interactions that become commonplace in which one party is condescending or belittling. So many times, comments of this nature come under the guise of, I'm just trying to help, or I
Mm-hmm.
know this, so I think you should know it too. The initiating party may not even realize that what they're saying is offensive. They may truly believe that their comments are benign, but what is really happening is their unconscious biases are surfacing. This is where I think businesses play a role. Bias training is an invaluable way to get people thinking about what baggage we all bring into interactions. It doesn't call anyone out for being wrong and insensitive, but it brings those thoughts and statements that we all make into the forefront of our minds so that they're all more sensitive to how we interact with one another.
Okay, so we pretty much covered the orange category of my chart, which was that condescension, lecturing, that diatribe, gossiping, quarreling, and arguing. So I'm going to move directly onto the green category. So we are coming into the healthy and productive types of conversation, but they're still going to be one-sided. So this would include debate, coaching, consultation, policy, discourse, discussion. And then finally, the blue category, the most healthy types of conversation and communication include conversation, compromise, and dialogue. So, with those in mind, those categories that are healthier, how should effective leaders balance these two healthier types of conversation? Can you give me an example of someone who is an effective leader, and how would he or she choose to communicate with subordinates?
First, I think there are times for discussion, debate, and compromise, but there are also times when those types of conversations simply won't do. Good leaders must know the times to allow for two-sided conversation and the times when just giving directions is the most efficacious way to handle a situation. Rather than name a leader, can I give you some examples of how good leaders communicate?
Absolutely.
They're open and honest in their interactions with others. They follow through with what they say they will do. They follow up on unresolved issues, and when they're unable to do something for whatever reason, they let their employees know. People respect honesty. None of us expects our superiors to be superheroes, but we do expect them to respect us, our work, and our time. There's no better way to show that than to be honest.
Okay, so moving on from the workplace and into more public settings, I've seen a lot of examples in the news lately of adults utilizing unhealthy methods of conversation, whether it's trying to buy toilet paper or shaming someone for not wearing a mask or for standing too closely together. So, how should we react to toxic public confrontation?
First, evaluate the situation. Are you or anyone else in danger? Can this situation escalate to where someone could be in danger? If violence is a possibility, please remove yourself in the best way that you can and call the authorities depending upon what's happening.
Okay.
If we're talking about people making nasty, rude comments, then I would say to ask yourself if it's worth responding. Sometimes responding will only make us more upset. If the instigator is already agitated, they won't be able to listen to reason. That would have to happen later, if it happens at all. Sometimes the biggest win comes from being the more mature adult in the situation and refusing to engage.
Refusing to engage, I think, is a great tip. Thank you. On that note, do you think that communicative growth is stagnant for some adults?
Yes. Many adults are stuck in their ways and think that the way they communicate is correct, or they don't even think about their communication style at all. Nothing will change if people aren't willing to put in the work to make it happen.
So true. We both have English degrees. We've both taught English in the classroom. We either read a lot for the love of it or for our careers. So, Niyama, in your opinion, how closely are communicative skills related to the amount that a person reads each day? Is there a correlation between words read and vocal skills, even for adults?
I think they're very closely related. There are numerous studies that cite this fact. Reading and being read to help us develop skills that aid in healthy communication. Hearing inflection, varying vocabulary, learning about sarcasm, and seeing how relationships play out through the written word are all excellent benefits of reading. Ideally, we take what we learn through reading and apply it to our own lives for our benefit, and perhaps even the benefit of others.
Okay, conversely, if we see teens and adults interacting poorly with each other on countless Netflix and primetime shows, where they revel in the power of words over others. And yet more and more, we're starting to see these moments of awareness against bullying and those types of behaviors. It's been my experience that if students don't see healthy types of conversation modeled for them, then they don't have a benchmark for how to communicate in a healthy way with others. In your professional opinion, does exposure to adult shows educate teens for the better, or does it hinder the communicative skills of these teens?
There are many variables to consider here. What kinds of shows? Are they being watched in isolation or in the context of something greater? Are there adults around to help shepherd the teen through the difficult parts of the show? I would have to say that as long as there's healthy conversation surrounding the exposure, then the teens should make out just fine. Because after all, if the shows are being used as a vehicle to get to healthy communication, or healthy communication as a byproduct, then they should end up in a healthier place.
Okay, I'd like to talk next about some general behaviors or tips that our listeners can adopt to stymie the negative behaviors of others. Like you said earlier, avoidance, removing yourself from a situation as the mature adult, or to tips that can at least communicate in the world without regret for one's own behaviors. How do we act so that we don't later regret the way that we act? So my question is, what tips can you share with our readers who are going out and communicating with others around the world across a variety of platforms?
Oh boy, this is a hot button topic. If we're talking about social media, my suggestion is to keep it benign. Stay away from divisive issues. Social media is a great way to keep in touch with friends and family, but it should never replace face-to-face conversation. There's no substitute for reading the facial expressions, body language, and intonation that comes from a conversation. It's just a theory, but I think that society has gotten so polarized due in large part to the common practice of sending our every thought out into cyberspace with no accountability whatsoever.
Oh, that's something to think about. So I have a confession to make. About 5 years ago, when I was pregnant, which explains a lot, I had a lot of anger that I suddenly had to deal with, and I felt like a teenager again. And as a Star Wars fan, I know from Master Yoda that fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And so I knew I needed coping mechanisms so that I wouldn't just start yelling at random strangers. And I invented this game. I called it the empathy game. It's where I made up a reason behind why a stranger behaved so badly. For example, that they really needed to cut me off in the Starbucks line because they were headed to the hospital, or some such excuse. And I realized that my excuse will never match the true reason for the behavior, but sometimes it made me feel better. One time I had created an imaginary reason that was wrong, but I offered a person grace in just creating this fake reason. And then I found out that that person was incredibly sick. And I was really relieved that I hadn't treated her badly just out of the habit of wanting to correct her rude behavior. And I realized that offering a person grace, even when they haven't earned it necessarily, creates a healthy mindset and cuts out so much negativity for me. So as easy as it is to want to just cut somebody out sometimes in the professional workplace, for example, that's impossible. So I was thinking about how to model good behaviors with disagreeable people. And I came back to Mr. Fred Rogers. And I have a quotation from his show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, that I want to share with listeners. It's this, quote, "Mutual caring relationships require kindness and patience, tolerance, optimism, joy in the other's achievements, confidence in oneself, and the ability to give without undue thought of gain." Would you say that's true? What is his quote missing? And my final question would be, what final sage advice, Niyama, can you share with our listeners about how to foster healthy, successful relationships with others?
Well, let me say first that I love that quote. I would add that we should assume that others have honest intentions and kindness in their hearts until they prove otherwise. Like you said, we don't always have the benefit of knowing what's going on behind the scenes. Sometimes offering others grace is as helpful for us as it is for them.
So true. Thank you, Niyama, for your time today and for your expertise. I truly appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
And listeners, I hope you will tune in again for our next episode. Until then, please subscribe to our podcast and leave reviews and comments below. Until next time.